Dr. Hens Runhaar has been kind enough to present today on mainstreaming climate adaptation. Hens was part of the assessment committee in Anja Weiss's PhD defense yesterday, and I pounced on that opportunity and asked if you could do a presentation, and I'm happy you said yes. So I'm looking very forward to this as well. I hope you are as well. It's going to be a totally different context than the Dutch one. So we're going to learn from something totally different now than much of what we've been hearing so far. So Hens, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here because what I've learned from Martin, also what I saw this afternoon, it seems that you're very actively engaged and involved in what's happening in practice. You as students, as academics, but also municipal practitioners. You really cooperate and work on adaptation and mitigation issues, which is quite different from how we in the Netherlands, at least the academics, do research and try to help practice. So I would like to discuss some findings from the Netherlands in terms of mainstreaming of climate adaptation in urban planning, all the difficulties that are encountered and how you can overcome them. It's partly based on research of my own, and in part on research by these two ladies, Helene Mees and Caroline Uiterbroek. They are doing PhD research on adaptation of climate change at Utrecht University, and they form part of a big national research program called Knowledge for Climate, which is sponsored by municipalities and other public actors who are vulnerable to climate change. And they have sponsored a very big program in order to come with usable knowledge so that they can base their adaptation strategies on. But it's still rather traditional type of research, ivory tower research. PhD students, of course, they meet municipalities, but some of them only need them for collecting data and then go back to their ivory tower. So it's different from your approach. Okay. Well, what I would like to discuss briefly, why adapting to climate change, but very briefly, because I think this morning we already have seen a lot of information about this. Then something about how we can adapt, briefly in terms of fiscal measures, and I would like to give some more attention to the governance aspects of adaptation. So I understood that a part of you are working on governance issues in this semester, so I hope we can have a discussion on that. Barriers to mainstreaming, a brief overview, and then more practical strategies how to overcome barriers. And I'm really interested to see to what extent the findings from the Netherlands are recognizable in the Danish context. Then I will conclude with some practical implications. Okay, so why adapting? First of all, what is adapting? I've taken the IPCC definition of adaptation. So adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits mutual opportunities. So that's adaptation. And why should we adapt? Well, we've already heard the examples. The expected increase in extreme weather events, things like floods, heat stress, whatever. Things that will, if we're not prepared, will pay a lot of money, will cost a lot of money. So, two examples from the Netherlands. We also face climate change. The two important effects will be heat stress and flooding. Well, heat stress is a rather new phenomenon. I guess also in Denmark. Is there? Do you know the concept of heat stress?
It's when temperatures increases 20.
Then you have heat stress. Well, yeah. Well, it depends on the country. Where for Eskimos, 20 degrees is that's above the threshold, I think. But in the Netherlands, there's expected to be more heat waves. temperatures could rise up to almost 4 degrees for the top 10% warmest summer days, and that may cause all kinds of inconveniences, up to hundreds of additional deaths, and that's something many people don't realize. Heat stress really can have severe health impacts, but also less dramatic effects like discomfort, loss of labor productivity because you're sleeping on the office, where there's if you didn't have good night's sleep. And the vulnerable groups are not only the elderly, but they may also be young people, people with chronic illnesses. So although we don't realize it, it's a threat to human health, and it's expected to intensify. Well, flooding. Almost 60% of our country is flood prone, which means vulnerable to flooding. Of course, we've built a lot of dikes and a lot of engineering. There's still a risk of flooding, and the expectation is that there will be more showers, will be more intense rainfall, but also more increased chance of flooding in rivers. So in 1995 we had mass evacuations because there was a near flood of the river Rhine and the river Meuse. It was only a 1 in a 50 years event, but that may increase in a 1 to 10 years event if we don't do anything. And you can think, well, it's not really dramatic, but the economic costs may be huge, also because the value at stake has increased due to increased urbanization, increased economic value. So the damage already in 2040 may be twice or 250% the damage in 2000, which is quite significant. Okay, so I hope you understand that there's a felt need to adapt. And the question is, how can we adapt? We can adapt in a traditional way, try to broaden the sewage systems, build higher dikes. But of course, adaptation is also about more innovative measures. So try to find measures outside the traditional policy sectors. I think the last presentation before the break was about sustainable urban drainage systems, if I remember well. But this means also dealing with floods, with water nuisance, but in another domain, in the spatial planning domain. So that also is innovative, but also means well, it raises all kinds of practical problems. So you have the measures and you have the governance, which is about how can we get these measures implemented. What role is there for public and for private actors? In my opinion, the problem is not so much that we don't have enough physical adaptation measures, but I think it's more about the governance, and that's something I would like to elaborate a bit further. So, an example of all kinds of heat stress reducing measures, adaptation measures we took from the literature, only to show that there's quite a list of these adaptation measures. For flooding, it's even a bigger list, so I don't think there's a lack of measures. We know how to adapt to climate change. But the governance is another issue. And I think, well, Carolina Uiterbroek, so she's one of the 2 PhD students that I just mentioned. She distinguishes between broadly 2 approaches how you can govern climate change. You can develop a new policy domain dedicated to climate adaptation with specific goals, with a nice new policy process in which the main goal is climate proofing. You can also try to integrate it into current policy domains. So for instance, spatial planning, infrastructure, water, and that's the so-called mainstream approach. But that's a totally different approach, because here it's not about climate proofing per se, but it's more about finding synergies with other policy domains, policy objectives, and it's not about optimizing in terms of climate proofing, but it's more about achieving a good performance in terms of all the objectives at issue. Is this a self-evident distinction, or is this new to some of you?
new for some of us.
Okay. Well, here's to illustrate how the two approaches can result in different measures. On the one hand, we paint roofs white, so they reflect more sun. It's also a way in which you can adapt to intensified heat stress, but it's an example of what we call a dedicated policy adaptation policy. You can also say, now we want to mainstream heat stress into other policy domains. We want to find synergies with other policy domains. And then you can think of green roofs, which are not only used for reducing heat stress, but also water retention and perhaps for urban agriculture. So the two approaches also mean different measures. So in the scientific literature there seems to be a consensus that the mainstreaming approach is the best way to govern climate adaptation. It's efficient. Urban planners are found not to invest in climate adaptation measures per se because of uncertainty about climate change, because of the dominance of more short-term objectives, the risk of over-adaptation. So practice shows that urban planners often don't invest in adaptation only for climate proofing. So that's why many scholars think, well, we should mainstream adaptation instead of developing it as a separate policy domain. And well, there's a quest for the search for no regret measures. But still, if you look at practice, also mainstreaming shows a very slow uptake, and there are many barriers to mainstreaming. And these barriers can be found at various stages in the policy process. It has to do with our understanding of climate change and their impacts. It's about the sense of urgency. It's about financial barriers. It's about technical barriers. Organizational barriers, I think they were already addressed in the student presentations. So there are many barriers to mainstreaming climate adaptation into other policy processes. Well, then the question is, okay, what are the main barriers? Wiesbroek is a scholar from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. He made a recent review of scientific papers on barriers to climate adaptation. Who has any idea of how many scientific papers have been published about barriers to climate adaptation? Who can think of a number?
No.
No one.
3,000.
Sorry?
3,000.
3,000? No. What do you think, 10, 20,
50.
50?
None.
What did you say? 50? Well, he already identified 80 papers, so it's quite a lot. And he looked at, well, okay, what are the main categories of the barriers identified. And he saw that institutional and social barriers are the most important, followed by informational barriers. So localized projections of climate change impacts, but in particular the organization of responsibilities and also of the perception of climate change as an issue. We also did some research ourselves in the Netherlands, and well, what we found is that behind all these barriers there are at least three fundamental challenges. One is that there's a lack of responsibilities for adaptation outside the traditional policy domains. There are unclear responsibilities, and responsibilities may be fragmented. So that's also a problem. And the second one is that although we expect that spatial planners or infrastructure planners, they should mainstream adaptation into their policies, the framing of climate adaptation is not very appealing. Or it doesn't seem very appealing to these planners. So they should be convinced that adaptation is a good thing to do. And then if we look at actors outside the municipalities, we find that private actors, companies, and citizens, they tend to look at the municipality to take action in order to adapt to climate change. So what strategies can you think of overcoming these challenges? Or regarding the responsibilities, well, you could say you could have legislation in order to require policy sectors to adapt to climate change, to make it an integral part of their policies. We could more practically use existing tools like environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental assessment to also include climate proofing as an element, etc. But before we can implement such institutional reform, there should be a sense of urgency. So I think the second challenge perhaps is most important. The challenge of reframing climate adaptation in such a way that it's appealing to urban planners. And I have a few examples which give some idea of how you can reframe climate adaptation in order to make it more attractive. This one is from the Biesbroek guy again, who suggests, well, we should deconstruct adaptation or reframing it towards more definable, more recognizable problem, like water safety. I think it's also good to try to understand urban planners who were found in the Netherlands to say that adaptation is not an issue, but nevertheless invested in climate adaptation measures like green roofs. But they followed the reverse logic, because not that they invested in these measures because of adaptation. No, they used adaptation as an additional argument in order to convince their politicians that these measures were really necessary. So in that respect, perhaps it's good not to speak of adaptation, but to link it directly to policy objectives, like livable cities or future robust cities, whatever. What I take from Anja Wijs's dissertation is that it could be good to mobilize external networks. Look for win-win situations, but again, then you have to find a way of reframing the issue and to connect it to other interests. These are also from Anja's dissertation. I think it was the Aarhus city, in which the kind of coalition of municipal actors and companies decided adaptation is important, or mitigation is important, but because it was part of a so-called green growth discourse. I think the first presentator this morning also addressed the importance of creating green jobs. There could be a way in which you can reframe the adaptation and also the mitigation challenge in order to make it more appealing. You can also say, well, it saves cost, it increases efficiency if you invest in particular measures. And then the third challenge, how to overcome all these other actors to only look at the municipality and don't take action themselves. Well, private actors, at least in the Netherlands, they're only partly required to implement adaptation measures. Like in the Netherlands, house owners by law are required to provide some water retention facilities, but in practice they don't. And these laws are not enforced by municipalities. So you need to have policy instruments in order to activate these actors to adapt. And this is taken from a research by Helene Wees, which is the other PhD candidate that I just shown. And she did a research on green roof policies in 5 countries. And she's compared the policy instruments that were in place. And as you see here, in particular, this is interesting, the percentages that the 2 cities where the most green roofs have been implemented, in Basel and Stuttgart, are cities where it is mandatory to install green roofs for new buildings. So in other cities there are subsidies or there's information campaigns, but they are not so effective. So this may also be a way in which you can mobilize adaptation by other actors. Then there's also the question of who should govern climate adaptation. Well, someone has to take the lead, someone has to believe in adaptation. It could be what Anja calls the institutional entrepreneurs, planners who are really convinced about the importance of adaptation. But you can also think of NGOs, people working at NGOs, individual consultants. But of course, you as students also have an important role. If you do your projects for municipalities, it's also a way of engaging with planners and convincing them about the importance of adaptation. And academics like Martin, for instance, this whole climate lab project is also a way in which you can try to influence adaptation. So, my main conclusion is, mainstreaming is complicated. There are many barriers, but I think the three challenges that I discussed are three of the fundamental challenges. And I think it would be good to look for innovations in adaptation governance. I understand that you also have to do kind of assignments. Perhaps framing of adaptation is a very nice topic. How can you reframe adaptation in such a way that it's appealing to people who have to make decisions on adaptation? But also in terms of how it is governed, who should take the lead, who should do what. Can we also involve citizens, and in the type of measures that you can think of. So distinguishing between these dedicated measures and more synergetic measures. Okay, that was my presentation.
Comments and questions? Hens?
So I'm Tragan from Mahidol University. So I have some question regarding your adaptation measures, like no regret on using like green infrastructure. So I made some study with a green roof in Thailand. So not all the cases that have been positive for energy consumption. Because of the green roof system in Thailand, they produce with a box and soil, organic soil. And the organic soil have been transported somewhere far away from the place that going to be used. So if you see overall impact, maybe it's overall it's going to have like more energy consumption than energy reduction consumption at the end. So it's not always positive. So I'm not sure that no regret going to be there.
Yeah. There will always be trade-offs, but my point is more that you have to try to find synergies. Not only focusing on climate proofing and one particular aspect, but broader aspects of objectives should be taken into account. Yeah, and of course you have to pay attention to negative effects as well.
And one more question about the policy that green roof installation in the country. Like whether there are any assessment prior to make that policy that at the end you're going to have like save energy, save carbon dioxide, or what are the overall impact of this policy implementation, or they just publish the policy without any assessment? Like there are some kind of regulation that you need to install green roof at every house. So is there any previous study or pre-study on the impact of that installation?
You mean the fiscal aspects of these green roofs? To what extent they retain water, prevent floods?
And
I think that there is a lot of literature on that as well. But as a simple social scientist, I'm not familiar with that. I only look at the percentages of roofs that have been green, so to say.
But on that, have you looked at the two cases you presented, Basel and Stuttgart, where it's mandatory? Did you look at the history of that? When did it become mandatory and what were the reasons behind it?
I can show that. It's been in place longer, so that may also explain why there's more surface being greened. But I don't think it will explain everything. What's also important to see is that the prices of green roofs are lower in these cities, and that may also have to do with that there's a particular market. If it's mandatory, you have to buy these green roofs, which may make it more of a large-scale production. So it may also help lower prices. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Not really, but I mean, because actually I have a similar case in Thailand that government published a policy on making the green building, but they have never have any assessment before that whether that green building can have positive impact or negative impact. So they just think that it's green, it's good, so make it.
Yeah. Of course, you have to evaluate whether or not this helps in terms of heat stress, flooding, whatever. Yeah.
But I don't understand, sorry, how can you have a negative impact? What can be a negative impact of a green roof?
Rising energy consumption, for example, for...
Wow, what?
For example, you transport soil from like 100 kilometers away from the place that you make that green roof on top of your building. And you transport water up to just like for the beautiful garden on the roof. It all costs energy. And if that energy costs more than the one that you save for air conditioning system, which is like 1 to 6 degrees Celsius or less than that, depending on the case. So at the end you get nothing and you think that you are good.
Okay.
So it's right up your alley on life cycle assessment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it depends pretty much on where it's built, and because the idea in Basel, and I studied something like that in Hamburg, and I think in that case you don't really need to bring water up because there is enough water coming from the sky. So the problem is how to infiltrate water slowly, and in that case it works. And actually I think it's a great idea to make it mandatory when you build a new building, because in this way the structural building is made to support extra weight. And so in this way you can deepen the soil, and so you have a quite big retention. But this depends on the structural capacity of the building. So if it's made in this way, like since when the building is designed, then you have a very good retention capacity. But perhaps, of course, I never thought about this. Perhaps in a very hot climate, then you need to bring water up. So
Now I understand.
But the solution could be the brown roof, because they also have brown roofs where you don't have vegetation. You only have soil or stones, permeable stones. So you don't need to bring water. So you can mitigate the negative impact of green roof with brown roof, for instance, in that context.
In my opinion, it's just like if you have any strategy, at least it's important to know the actual impact of that specific case before making decision or making policy. Or else you can end up as like greenwash.
But the type of green roofs perhaps indeed are more use brown roofs, particular vegetation and not used for gardening, more for water retention, and also helps isolating these buildings.
I'm quite curious about the role of the water boards in the Netherlands, because you have these specific water utility authorities, and the role they play in terms of adaptation. Do they have a coordinating role in between the different regions and municipalities, or how does that work?
Yeah, well, they have their own jurisdictions, and they have their own typical policy instruments, the dikes, etc. But adaptation basically requires also measures outside the traditional domain. So it's also in their interest that municipalities, for instance, have more blue and green infrastructure, because then they have to invest less in strengthening these dikes, etc. But they don't coordinate it. It also has to do with the fragmented nature of the adaptation. Everybody is involved and has something to say about it. There's not one responsible actor. If it's about these new forms of adaptation, so outside the traditional.
Can I follow up on that a little bit? Because what you're saying is, for example, in Peter's case, that they would be interested in doing green infrastructure in municipalities, because then their investments in dikes and similar would be less. Would they be sort of thinking here? Would they be willing to invest in a service like that? Or are they saying, please do that because then we invest less, but we will not pay you for it?
As far as I know, they are involved in the planning and thinking, in the preparatory stages.
Okay.
But I don't know of any case in which they actually pay municipalities in order to do so. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm curious to know what the 95 flood in the Netherlands, for instance, was glacier water coming from Switzerland and Austria and river runoff, so to speak.
Yeah.
Is there any data on flooding caused by heavy rainfall versus flooding by too much water from neighboring countries coming to the Netherlands?
There must be, but I'm not an expert in that area.
Because I can imagine that making canals or something like this, or finding, creating river or basins for too much water would then, if it turns out that most flooding is caused by glacier water, something like this, would make more sense than in this particular case, green roofing, for instance.
Yeah, of course, green roofs don't help if the River Rhine it has too much water. Yeah, but I think adaptation, it's an intensification of these extreme events with both more glacier water and heavy rainfall, so when it all comes together. And for Netherlands, it would be very nice if Germany would invest in widening the Rhine or whatever, then we would have less problems. Yeah, it's also a way of thinking. Okay.
Thank you very much.